We are discussing international security, US role in international security in the age of coronavirus with Mary Beth Long and Luke Coffey. Since we don't have a lot of time, I'm not going to go over their amazing resumes, but we want to get to the discussion as quickly as possible. Um, so, and I don't want to talk too much, but this session is part of a series of sessions we've organized on the U.S. role, U.S. global role, U.S. role in the Middle East. We hope to organize a couple more. Basically, we are asking similar questions every session: how the international system, how U.S. foreign policy, how U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East will be evolving. So this session is dedicated to international security. We have with us, we are lucky to have Mary Beth Long and Luke Coffey with us to discuss these issues. And I want to start with Mary Beth at the beginning. And can you give us your sense of how things might evolve in terms of international security over the next few years, given the coronavirus environment and all these things that surreal times we are going through?
Sure. I think I'd like to start out by saying that in many respects, it's a little bit too early to tell, but I can draw upon, I just spent almost a month in Egypt, the UAE, before that was in Oman and Qatar, also in Saudi and Jordan, right before, and frankly, almost got stuck in Egypt as the virus was breaking. And from a US perspective, I think there are two things that we should be thinking about. And the first is perhaps a misunderstanding about how the US is approaching the virus and what is generally viewed, at least I believe in the Middle East and somewhat with the Europeans, is a lack of US leadership. And they are looking at us as if we're confused, and maybe we are. I think part of that is a reflection, though, on the decision of this administration to allow a lot of the decision making and a lot of the activities to be done by the states. But in any event, the role of the US in the coronavirus, I think from a security perspective, at least in the Middle East, has them somewhat confused. There's a lot of Chinese and Russian propaganda that it is having a tremendous impact on our readiness, which is untrue. As far as I can tell, the Iranians have, in several respects, I think, tested and probed whether or not the virus has had any implications for our readiness. And I think that those are probably overblown to the extent that I have seen any readiness implications. They're almost all domestic. Sort of getting to the bigger picture, both NATO and the EU, there are interesting trends. The biggest trend is on the positive side, the US and those large multilaterals being able to deal with the coronavirus, but it also being in conjunction with no lessening of all the other threats that those institutions and their bodies are facing. And in the Middle East in particular, and in Africa, that does have certain trends with implications for overall security, mostly with implications for the Europeans when it comes to increased terrorist activity and migrations and refugees that result therefrom. I think that from a large strategic perspective, it has made a lot of our allies quite hesitant to deepen their security relationships with China. Some of them are also looking at their commercial relationships with China. One can only hope that it has implications for NATO members, including and particularly the Brits and their decision regarding Huawei and the ties with China in that respect. On Russia, I haven't seen much coronavirus implications for how not only the Europeans, but the Middle East are looking at Russia, in part because they've been fairly consistent in keeping a lockdown on what is happening there. But I do think that it has made all of them reconsider not only medical and other source dependencies with China and others, but to some extent, source dependencies that go all the way to Russia as to whether or not they are over-reliant with the Russians in certain ways with their equipment and their military, particularly their ground forces. I'll leave it at that, and we can come back around with specifics on all of that.
Yes, thank you. Luke, please.
Thank you, and thanks for arranging for this virtual event here today. I actually agree very much with Mary Beth Long that it is really too early to tell how this is going to play out in a broader geopolitical sense. But I think even so, one could draw some logical conclusions on at least the trajectory of geopolitics in the short to medium term. And in that, in terms of my opening remarks, I would say that we need to look at our future geopolitical environment on like 4 key assumptions. The first one is that the challenges that we had before coronavirus are going to be there after coronavirus. That there isn't going to be some sort of very clean cut, neat before and after period. Iranian aggression, as Mary Beth said, they're already testing and probing us in the Gulf. Russia is going to continue to occupy Crimea and parts of Georgia and continue to provoke aggression. China is going to continue doing what it does in the South China Sea and some of its predatory investment practices with its Belt and Road Initiative. So these challenges will remain, but how we address some of these challenges is likely to change. And that leads me to my second assumption, which is that we're going to have less resources, at least in the medium term, to deal with these challenges. We already had a crisis inside NATO about spending enough on defense. You know, in the immediate term, we could very well see more European countries spending 2% of GDP on defense, because there's going to be a lag period from the point that national budgets are reallocated and reduced, and the point of national GDP going down so quickly that if you have a much lower GDP but you're still spending roughly the same amount on defense before the defense budget gets cut, then you might be meeting 2% of GDP, but you're meeting 2% of something that is a lot less than what it was before. So I think we have to get smarter and more sophisticated with how we deal with some of these issues and challenges with our allies in terms of burden sharing and trying to really do more with less. The third assumption is that many of the regimes that cause us problems, whether it's Russia or Iran, have a history of being provocative and aggressive when they become desperate. And if the current situation with the global pandemic isn't going to be desperate enough for them to change some of their ways, then I don't know what would be. So we should assume, since a lot of these regimes are built on the idea of, they're led by the idea of regime preservation, right? The elites at the top preserving their rule and their power. One of the biggest ways that an autocratic regime can lose power is by being viewed as illegitimate or not able to provide for the people. And as countries like Russia or Iran start to suffer more and more from the COVID-19 pandemic, then you could see the leadership becoming more desperate to try to keep rule. And as they become more desperate, then that's when they do stupid things. And then the fourth one is more of a technical point, but it goes back to military readiness. In the recent past, at least, the US military and its allies have operated in parts of the world that have not had the most advanced healthcare infrastructure, healthcare systems. And looking ahead into the future, these are the likely types of places where the US military and its allies will continue to have to operate from time to time. And in these sort of environments that have a reduced healthcare capacity, I can only assume that the pandemic will have more of an impact and will hang around longer, which has an impact on how our military operates in these regions. So the US has been pretty good over the years at trying to adapt to new circumstances, new environments. And I suspect that, operating in a pandemic environment, a healthcare emergency environment, whether it's northern Syria or southern Afghanistan or wherever else, is going to have to be factored in into the doctrine and the military planning. So that's something that we need to, policymakers need to keep an eye on. The final point I'll conclude my opening remarks with deals with China. In many ways, China is on the front foot right now, at least in the short term. It's been able to restock its strategic crude oil reserves at record low prices, while most of the world is either entering their lockdown or in the middle of their lockdown. China is starting to come out of theirs, and they've taken advantage of the confusion with huge amounts of propaganda that was already alluded to. And this propaganda we're finding, while it's often original to China and Russia for that matter, opportunistic countries like Iran are repeating this propaganda and using it. So it's not as if they're kind of creating it, but they're taking advantage of what China's already putting out there, seeing what sticks, and then they're using it to their advantage too. And then there's, of course, this debate that we haven't had yet in the United States, or really had yet in the West. We flirted with this debate a bit, but we haven't really had it. And that is about how we treat supply chains, which sectors of our supply chain and manufacturing should be out of China, which ones should stay. This is going to be a very messy ideological, political debate. Some of this will be driven by market desires. Perhaps Americans will take a different point of view, and market forces will demand that some stuff is produced elsewhere other than China. Some might come down from the government and government directed, if it involves like the security of the United States, for example. But we are in the very early days of this very big debate, which I think is going to be a very messy and controversial and bloody one. Then I'll just end there.
Thank you, Luke. Maribeth, did you have any comments on what he said before I ask my other questions?
I don't, except I wanted to add I think everybody knows that economic pressures, not only in the US, and they're already talking about the NDAA, but particularly in the European states, is going to be probably, I think everyone can count on limited resources or lessened resources for the militaries going forward. There's, in my point of view, there's surprisingly little talk about two issues that I think are more current, and understanding whether or not they're a trend and what the implications are. And the one is particularly interesting for the Europeans and for NATO, and that is the fact that ISIS and Al-Qaeda in certain circumstances, but a lot of non-state actors are using the pandemic not only to increase their activities where they are. We've had a huge uptick in ISIS in Iraq, in part because of our drawdown, which has nothing to do with the pandemic, but may be coincident with the understanding that we may be in a weaker position because of the pandemic and the drawdown and the coincidence of those events. You have, particularly in Africa, large recruitment, prison breaks, terrorists and other jihadis being let out that are adding to one side or the other, whether it's Al-Shabaab or other indigenous terrorist organizations, governments that are unstable and have limited resources that are not only distracted, but are applying those limited resources to the virus, and the possible implications long-term, 5, 6, 3 years down the line, that you have more internally displaced people, more jihadis that are better resourced, more migration, and a bigger problem and push against those Northern African countries that are really problematic for the EU member countries as far as refugees and immigration, and a problem that NATO really hasn't figured out what kind of role it's going to play and how it's going to play it in the future. I see that situation actually worsening. So that's point number one. Point number two, you have Al-Qaeda and ISIS also calling for their jihadis that are in place in Europe and in the West to engage in attacks. And whether or not that had any impact on Germany declaring finally, after all these years, Hezbollah illegal in the last days, and the basically the raid on Hezbollah organizations and affiliations is unclear. But I think it remains to be seen whether that call for increased activities by jihadis placed already abroad results in any activities. And then finally, I think it's interesting to see the implications for proxy support. On the one hand, you have Turkey that has doubled down in Libya. That conflict is going full speed ahead. Not only the Turks, but the Russians and others have double and tripled down on their support for proxies there while the pandemic is going on, and resources you would assume would be somewhat impacted. On the other hand, you have Turkey sort of easing up a bit, at least arguably, in northern Syria. So the question is, what are the implications for this various places where proxies are acting, and what will we see as far as stress upon not only our NATO allies, but states and non-state actors as to the proxyism? I think as far as Iran is concerned, we haven't seen any diminution at all in what they've done abroad. In fact, we've seen an uptick. How sustainable that is and whether or not it's had any long-term implications for Iran, I think is still out, but it's certainly trending toward status quo ante, but not much more than that. I'll stop there.
Thank you. You touched upon NATO, and that was my next question. So how do you guys assess how NATO fared in this coronavirus threat environment? Was NATO solidarity robust enough, effective enough in your eyes? And how, I mean, Luke talked about the funding issues, and it's gonna, there in absolute numbers, there's gonna be less available resources probably for NATO and for the national militaries. But how do you think NATO fared in meeting this crisis?
So far, so good. I mean, NATO has. Sorry, was that directed at me or?
I was going to say I'm interested in what Luke has to say. I'm sorry, Kadir.
No, it's the moderator's fault. I didn't field it to a specific person, but go ahead, Luke.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, I think they've come out looking pretty good so far, especially when compared to their sister institution, the European Union, when there's been a feeling that the EU has been very slow to react. It could have very early on invoked its solidarity clause that was put into the Lisbon Treaty for situations just like this. There's been a lack of cohesion by the member states of the European Union on the best approach to take, which has led to a fragmented EU policy. But it's also a consequence of the fact that healthcare isn't really a policy that the EU Commission has a lot of policy competency over. So I think many people were hoping that the EU was going to be able to deliver more than it was really ever designed to do in a situation like this. That's why I think NATO looks like it's been able to deliver, because it's taken more of a practical approach. Perhaps there wasn't very high expectations on what NATO was going to do, if anything at all, as a collective intergovernmental security alliance. But luckily, in 1998, NATO created something called the Euro-Atlantic Disaster Response Coordination Center back in 1998, so more than 20 years ago. And this is a center that was created to coordinate alliance response, member state response to natural disasters, man-made disasters, this sort of thing. And it's been used a few times over the years, quite a few times, for like wildfires, earthquakes, and this sort of thing. So NATO used this to help coordinate among the member states in the alliance what the needs were, the practical needs in terms of mainly delivering stuff. And then they were able to use some NATO assets, some pooled NATO assets, to, for example, send a C-17 to South Korea to pick up testing to bring it back to somewhere, to some member state, for example. So in that sense, NATO has been able to deliver. But the timing of this is very interesting for NATO because they're undergoing this, what they call this reflection process. It was announced at the NATO meeting in London last December that the Secretary General of NATO was compiling this group of experts that will look at the future of NATO, the political cohesion, the mission of NATO going into the future. So there's no doubt that the global pandemic will factor into the thinking of those that are involved with this review. But we have to remember that at the end of the day, NATO as an intergovernmental security alliance is only as strong as the sum of its members. And ultimately, it's the responsibility of each member state to ensure that they maintain an armed forces that is healthy, trained, ready, capable. NATO really can't do anything in terms of the health of the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines in the 30 members. But the member states can. They have a big responsibility here. And also another issue that should concern NATO that it doesn't have much direct control over, but it can still impact NATO, is the focus of a lot of countries using their militaries to support civil authorities. And during a time like this, you would expect this. I mean, no one's saying that this is necessarily a bad thing, but a lot of European countries, because they don't have our same National Guard structure like we have in the United States, they overwhelmingly rely on their armed forces to provide support to civil authorities during times like this. And this will have an impact on readiness. This will have an impact on who's able to go fight if they need to somewhere else, how often they're able to train. So we have to think about this too as NATO goes forward in this COVID world.
Let me slip in just a little more, one more question on that one. Mary Beth, you've worked at the Pentagon at the highest levels. In a situation like this, US leading the NATO in a more sort of EU-US wide effort, do you think that's been missing, or was the kind of delivery Luke talked about has been sort of sufficient, robust enough? There was no need for mobilization of all NATO members around this challenge.
I have to say that I absolutely agree with what Luke said, and I was pleasantly surprised, not only with what I understand to be the US leadership at the military committee level, but the use of various NATO resources in something that, at least in my experience, NATO hasn't really dealt with pandemics of this level before, in that not only did they use the coordination center, but NATO used its strategic airlift. More importantly, I think for the first time, NATO really engaged some of its non-NATO partners, where we had Turkey supplying Norway, supplying to Spain, Turkey supplying to certain parts of Macedonia. There was really a mix of not only member states, but commercial aircraft and airlift. There were doctors sent via NATO auspices, either through the strategic airlift or through the NATO Support and Procurement Agency. There were medical masks and medical gear and suits and attire sent back and forth. I think there was actually an intensive care unit that was arranged through one NATO country to go through another, or a partner, to actually get to Spain. So I was actually very surprised, frankly, at NATO stepping in with the amount of resources and efforts that it had. The one place where I would fault not only US leadership, but NATO writ large, and this is a perpetual weakness, The Russians in particular were very aggressive, spreading rumors about NATO's lack of ability to respond at all, not only as an institution, but as member states. You know, NATO is spreading the virus. NATO exercises actually were part of the spread of COVID in Europe. We just don't do well, and NATO didn't do well in responding to those. But I was impressed, and my understanding was there was no lack of U.S. leadership. So,
Thank you. Thank you for those comments. Let me ask you this. Do you expect some sort of NATO fared well, EU didn't fare as much well, let's say. Do you expect some sort of nationalist backlash going forward, and sort of the nations becoming more inward looking, and that would have a bearing on international security going forward? And these kinds of I know you said NATO did well, but still, if the nations have lower budgets and then they are more inward looking, trying to make their next crisis, prepare for the next crisis, do you think those will have a bearing on the international security cooperation? Luke.
Okay.
Sorry.
Well, this is an example of a challenge, a geopolitical challenge that I said existed before the COVID pandemic, that will continue to be around after or during the pandemic. This knee-jerk reaction to nationalism, and in like the nasty sense, not to be confused with patriotism, in my opinion. And you'll see more of this, I think, in the short term, and perhaps it will widen in terms of how this kind of thinking is viewed by members of the public, simply because I think there will be a level of desperation by many, whether it's because of the terrible economic crisis that we're entering, or whether it's because of the medical and healthcare impact of the pandemic. There will be people who will want to try to find very easy and simplistic solutions to what are very complex problems. And I could see in a political sense, certain politicians, certain political movements taking advantage of this. But as we go through this, if this pandemic has shown anything, it shows that you can't just, I don't want to say put up a wall because that's a politically charged statement, but you can't like put up the drawbridge or build a moat around your country, because the world doesn't operate that way. And a global pandemic will take some sort of global coordination or global response. That doesn't mean we have to all become subservient, slaves to the WHO. But it does mean that we're going to have to work together in what is probably best described as good old-fashioned multilateral diplomacy and engagement. And I think we should stay away from big supranational organizations and new institutions, and we should find ways to fix what we have to make them work better for us in the 21st century. And we should also not be scared to just get a group, lead a group of nations and countries that want to work together on this, and find ways to cooperate and coordinate going forward.
Thank you. Maribeth?
I'm going to be a little provocative. I absolutely agree with everything Luke says, but I'll go further. Coalition governments in Europe are a reality that's not going to change. And one of the problems with the wide breadth of participants in European leadership is that from a security and defensive standpoint, defense does not do well when you have budgetary decision-making that are stressed over demographics, an older population with fewer abilities to earn money and have resource constraints on the government. When you combine that with arguments that why are we spending so much money on defense when, if anything, COVID taught us was, number one, we need to spend more money on healthcare. Number two, we've got immigration problems and refugee problems that don't really have much to do with defense, and we can prevent them if we spend more on infrastructure and healthcare and social programs and entitlement programs. And number three, to the extent that those are national security issues, the real problem is that our either racist or proxy organizations within our country from a domestic security perspective. Those are exacerbated by the influx of immigrants, and those are exacerbated by propaganda that is unmet. And if we as a nation take better care of them, we won't have to deal with external defensive issues as much as we think. And I don't think we're going to do well there. I think to the extent that we had 2%, I think Luke alluded to, some of the countries have been stepping up as soon as we get governments back engaged, that will be severely reduced, which will call into question the utility of the transatlantic partnership in some respects. It's already gone through a number of discussions about its relevance in today's climate and into the future. None, as Luke pointed out, none of the problems from an external point of view are going to be getting any better anytime soon. And yet we will have less committed resources and, I believe, less committed publics. So what does that mean? And for people like me, that means one of the problems you need to force Europe to deal with is, are you going to fund NATO or are you going to fund the EU? There needs to be a reality check on what is Europe getting for its EU participation, and why do we have potentially, we're constantly dealing with potential conflicts between the EU role, for example, in Libya, and national defense priorities in Libya. Can Europe sustain both? And what are the trade-offs, and are they worth it? And I would argue that that dialogue needs to come, but it won't come fast enough for the American public, who is quite fed up with what they view of having to pay too much of the share of European defense building, particularly when it comes to training, and that we will have a distancing or a bit of a chill between US and many of our European allies.
Mary Beth, then let me continue with a question to you. Luke talked about China, and my question is also about China, how the relations are going to look like going forward. So do you expect the kind of, how would the US and the West manage that? Because of the things that you just talked about, less commitment, less budgets, and on the other hand, China, in some ways, Luke said they took advantage of the low oil prices. Their economy shrunk quite a bit, but given the Trump's rhetoric and Pompeo's rhetoric on China, things are not going to look like U.S. and China are going to get along soon. How do you see that challenge happening if you take it as a challenge for the West, EU and the US?
I see, as Luke alluded, and Pompeo has been clear, that there will be a cold wind for the foreseeable future between the US and China, not just because of pandemic, not just because of Huawei, but primarily because of the conflict that has been brewing and basically occurs every day in the South China Sea and in the Pacific. I think that there will be a very difficult conversation in very few European countries. And it will be very limited to, are there technical or other aspects of our dependence, this is them speaking, with China that we need to moderate? Technical information sharing being probably the most important. And that's, at the end of the day, about it. NATO will continue to struggle with having its systems compromised by the lowest common denominator when it comes to security in its computers and in its shared defensive and interoperability at the end of the day, because European nations and the world will not be able to walk away from cheap Chinese products, and the robust economy and the robust and very focused governmental policies in China that will simply take more and more market share of more and more both critical and non-critical industries, and Europe simply can't afford to ignore that. So they will straddle with legs in both camps. Most of their legs in the China camp with cheap and good relations with China, and I'm not saying that's not a good thing or not necessary, but struggle with tough decision-making on large security issues that the US can afford to be more independent, and they will have a tough time making those decisions. I don't expect many of them to even consider them seriously.
Yeah. There's an audience question on Pompeo, so I just want to, before moving to Luke again, I want to pose that to you. They're asking, how do you view Pompeo's performance during the pandemic, including his strident anti-Beijing rhetoric?
Well, I think he's been consistently tough on China. But I have to say, it's a very interesting question because most of the focus, I think, for many of us in the United States, or even for those overseas, are on your domestic leaders, like the response from your local authorities, your state, what's coming out of the administration, the White House, on the daily press conferences, and Dr. Fauci and all these guys and girls. So to be quite honest with you, I haven't put much thought in how I would rate Pompeo's effort so far. But if, doing it as we speak, you can probably tell I'm trying to think about it in my head as I'm stalling for time right now. I would say actually he's done very well at sending, as America's top statesman, sending a very clear message that the relationship with China is not going to just continue on in the future all happily, that there are going to be some serious thinking going on about how the US needs to approach China in this or in this COVID era, and as we enter, God willing, the post-COVID era.
Mary Beth? I
agree. I think part of what Secretary Pompeo was also addressing was there was a surprising in my mind, but if you stop and think about it for just a minute, not so surprising, but just on the heels of people realizing that that the COVID deaths in China were very likely very much underreported, and that in fact that the Chinese government very likely hid the impact of the virus for not only weeks but months. Right on the heels of that, you had a really interesting Chinese charm offensive internationally, in which it was seen to be exporting doctors and exporting masks and kits, and turning its attention to saving the world from this virus. It just happened to be coming from China. And for just a brief period of time, even the Iranians gave it a go. They were exporting Iranian expertise or IRGC assistance to other nations. And I think part of Pompeo's, I think appropriately tough public statements was to put the kibosh on anyone buying into China has turned the corner, and we're now contributing to the recovery of the world of this unfortunate health debacle about which we had very little role or very little participation. No. So I think it was appropriate, and I'd like to see him further make those kinds of comments. I think we need to stand firm because the implications of the next time this happens, whether it's in China or elsewhere, and interestingly, no one wants to say it, but the last 4 or 5 COVID type flus, the bird flu, all were derived from China. It's a problem. No one is, I'm not implying that it was deliberate, but we have a problem with flus, swine flu, et cetera, coming out of China. And we need to deal with it as a international community, or we will just be on a constant cycle of the latest and greatest pandemic that has implications for all of us.
Thank you. So there's another audience question. Let me pose that and then I'll get back to my line of questions as well. Luke, the question is on your argument regarding insourcing of American goods. Aside from those exceptional items considered critical to US national security, are you suggesting trade barriers and tariffs? How will Wall Street react to this?
Oh, not at all. I am a free trader to my core. I'll quite happily continue to buy the best product at the cheapest cost as long as it doesn't impact U.S. national security, and I don't care if it's made on Mars. But I'm just saying that there will be a debate. There will be a big debate about this. You'll have people of the sometimes they're referred to economic nationalists, protectionists. You'll have this debate going on. And at the end of the day, I don't think all that much is actually going to change. Not because necessarily the consumer will want it to change, but perhaps the sourcer or the importer or the manufacturer will want a more dependable political situation than what they can find in China, or as Mary Beth alluded to, there's been a recent history of these types of viruses coming from China. Perhaps vendors or manufacturers will want to look elsewhere. But I think that Americans will still want to buy, they want an iPhone. Well, we barely like iPhones that cost like $1,000 a piece, right? Much less costing like $3,000 or $4,000 a piece. So I don't think necessarily a lot will change. Perhaps I'm wrong on the pharmaceutical side of things. I could be wrong on that. And I think that's probably the area where it will most likely change. But I do think that there's going to be a big debate about this, and it'll be a very political debate, a very ideological, passionate debate about this. And we'll see if the principles of free trade will come through this, or if we will start implementing more barriers and protectionist practices.
Thank you. So let's talk about a little bit about Russia. Russia's role in terms of disinformation in the US has been debated a lot. And in this context, now it's done by many actors around the world about the origins and how it was spread, the coronavirus. How do you see China's role, what has been called an infodemic, information kind of that is being circulating about, US sources and US invention of the virus even. So how do you think the relationship with Russia might evolve going forward? There's been a lot of reports about involvement in the presidential election as well, that kind of thing. So Mary Beth, we'll start with you.
Well, I come from 13 years at CIA, in which one of the very first things you learn is that the Russians have always been involved, to the extent that we've allowed them, intentionally or not, in our elections and our politics. And that Russian propaganda is the best in the business. I can recall in Latin America when Russian propaganda had half of my colleagues convinced that the US Sandinista war was about stealing baby parts. There were all kinds of implications regarding us sending back babies to be raised as Americans, to be enslaved. The fact that it just on and on and on. The Russians are masters at propaganda, and they do quite well. The Chinese don't do nearly as well, at least externally. Their internal control over their information is probably second to none. As far as Russia is concerned, absolutely. I think Russia, in some respects designed, but in many respects fell into a windfall. And they got exactly what they wanted in the 2016 and 2018 midterm elections, in that they have done tremendous damage to Americans' confidence in our electoral system. And that will continue in 2020 and into the future. And to the extent that we allow Russia to implicate and insert itself, and that we buy into this divisiveness between and among our various peoples, and particularly our political group, the more we should be ashamed of ourselves, but the more we let Russia win. China hasn't quite gotten to that level yet. Their propaganda is much more specific. It generally deals with an issue. We had Huawei. There's some really good Chinese propaganda videos that are quite well done on YouTube about why Huawei really is being painted unfairly by the US government. There's several about the virus. There's a doctor from Wuhan who has a tremendous video that makes you believe absolutely that China did not withhold information, did not persecute or prosecute people, particularly its medical community, in trying to get information out early on, and that all of this has been well handled by the Chinese, which is just, I think we're increasingly learning not to be the case. But the Chinese have a ways to go until they get as good as the Russians, at least externally.
So would you consider sort of, I don't know how to express this, but in disinformation, should the US and EU, the West, let's say, consider making it somehow a top concern of international security going forward?
Absolutely. We used to do that. We used to call it covert action or psychological operations or whatever you want to do. But we've become so politically correct that for some reason we've decided that as a government, we can't counter narratives effectively. We don't want to counter narratives effectively. We don't even try to get out ahead of a narrative and frame the discussion the way we did in the Cold War and the way we did even in World War II, which led to tremendous Western growth and the success of Western countries. The United States no longer has this skill or interest, and I believe it's one of our biggest national security deficits writ large. NATO in and of itself also not only does not allow it, but they view it as something bad or something not quite above board, and it's to our own detriment.
Thank you. Luke, you can address that as well, but there's another question for you as a follow-up to your insourcing thoughts. What opportunities could that present for countries like Mexico under USMCA and Central America under CAFTA?
Well, I'm not an international trade economist, so perhaps I've waded in already a bit too far on this matter. And some
Better
of my
you than me.
Yeah. But as someone anyone who follows, international affairs and geopolitics will follow these matters as well. So perhaps I can contribute something, very modestly contribute something to this issue, to this debate. Yeah, I think that there is an opportunity for some of these countries, and whether it's Mexico or in Central and South America or in other places in Asia. Like
Turkey. Mike Doran was suggesting Turkey as a manufacturing base for the US.
Yeah, well, there's already a healthy US-Turkish economic relationship that both leaders have said explicitly on a number of occasions that they want to grow. So yeah, I do think Turkey is a real possibility. These countries, though, have to make it lucrative for the investors and for the businesses to come there and set up shop, and they have to also show that there's a very sound and strong rule of law, independent judiciary, and all these other issues that will help entice international investors, and FDI. So I think that there is a lot of scope here for opportunity. And also I think public attitudes are going to change, at least on a superficial level. I don't know if it's going to change in terms of their pocketbook. But even now, no one really likes buying stuff from China, but we still all do, right? Because it's like usually the cheapest product. So I do think that without getting too far into an issue that I'm by no means an expert on, I do think that there's scope for new opportunities. And one way that the United States can help our partners in Europe or our partners in South America, Latin America, Mexico, is to find ways of promoting economic freedom, to promote real free trade, to reduce trade barriers, to lift unnecessary tariffs when they might be in place, to really boost economic productivity and economic cooperation. I mean, there are ways that this can be done. And if you would like more detailed proposals, I know the Heritage Foundation, we have 2 papers coming out soon. Actually 3. One's focusing on economic recovery in the Euro-Atlantic area. Another one is focusing on North America, so Canada, Mexico, and the United States. And there's one about economic cooperation, economic recovery in the Indo-Pacific, but within the context of the Quad nations, US, Japan, India, and Australia. So these are coming out. So, although we're all at home in different places, this is still Washington, D.C., so there's no such thing as like shameless self-promotion. So heritage.org, check it out. The papers will be up there in the coming days.
Great, Luke. We'll check it out. Thank you for that. Maribeth, there is a question about the Gulf. Given your recent trip to the region, you mentioned low oil prices are leading to deep fiscal issues in the GCC, especially. How do you think the Saudi OPEC policy has impacted the relationship with the US, especially with the reported threat from President Trump to pull troops from Saudi? Any thoughts on Egypt's regime stability under COVID? What about Oman's regime stability given solvency issues and the rule of a new sultan?
I'll do them in reverse order.
Sure.
The economic hardship in Oman due to COVID, but also due to the secondary and tertiary implications of the lack of tourists have been very difficult for them. They were budget stretched before the unfortunate death of the Sultan, but internally they're quite stable. Internally they're doing well, but it's going to be a budgetary issue for them, particularly because it's just basically the cessation of any other economic activity. For Egypt, surprisingly, when I was in Egypt, despite all the criticism about the Egyptian government, during the first couple weeks of March while I was there, we were regularly visited by the Egyptian government, our temperatures taken almost every day. Egyptian government officials getting on our bus to take our temperatures before we went into a hotel or a public place. Entering Egypt at the beginning of March, I was met in the airport, as were my fellow travelers, by someone taking our temperature and writing down where we were staying. That was not the case when I returned to the United States at the, I want to say the 20th of March to Dulles Airport, where on a direct flight from the Middle East, where no one asked us where we had been, no one asked us had we been exposed, and no one took our temperature. So I can't criticize Egypt. Now I know that the Egyptian government has been criticized as being spotty in dealing with the virus. I think it has given them much needed economic relief, however, as far as its oil and gas needs. The biggest problem with Egypt remains and is exacerbated to some extent by COVID, but it is the demographic boom and the disconnect between the population, the economy, the ability of Sisi to continue to provide subsidies that keep domestic turmoil tampened down, and the fact that in I think 3 or 4 more years we'll be at an 80+% unemployment of individuals, particularly men under the age of 25. So Egypt, long term, it's an exacerbating factor. For the Middle East, COVID writ large, and Saudi Arabia, I think the president was right as far as the price war between Saudi and the KSA. Interestingly, I think Saudi Arabia, or excuse me, Russia, that has been trying to build its credibility for decades now and has done a pretty good job, frankly, in the Middle East in getting stronger and more breadth to its relationships, not only with Saudi, but with the UAE, with the Qataris and others. A tremendous amount of political and other capital spent. I think they blew it, frankly, in large part with their war with the Saudis on the price of oil. Saudi Arabia cannot sustain the prices as they are and keep the Saudi Vision 2030 on track. Not only will it have a direct impact on Saudi Arabia's budget, which I think is geared toward a $50 or 40 on worst case scenarios per barrel pricing, but the necessary foreign investment that the plan and His Highness were looking for are scared off, I think, even further with the oil conflict with the Russians. At the end of the day, I think the president was right to call to the Crown Prince's attention that there are secondary and tertiary implications, not just this quarrel he has with Putin, and that there are certain accommodations that have to be made. Now, whether we are serious and would ever really benefit from pulling our troops and our military presence out of Saudi Arabia, I won't guess, but I certainly think to remind the kingdom, and in particular Prince Salman, that there are consequences to the impact of the price war on the US, notwithstanding rumors that Saudi Arabia was particularly interested in this, we'll say, conflict with Russia as a secondary implication that it destroyed the US fracking industry and therefore made it economically unviable for the US to have its alternative energy production that was giving us increasing independence. But so I think the president was right, and I think the Crown Prince, hopefully in the short term, will be accommodating the US in one form or another.
Thank you. Last question is about the topic again, US role in the international security system. And I'm particularly interested if you see a major change after the elections, regardless of who is elected. Do you feel like the dynamics we talked about are going to be the same for either a Democrat or Republican president, or if a Democratic president comes along, there will be perhaps more investment in international security, or less, depending on how you would view that. The November elections, basically, how do you think it might evolve after that? And that's my last question. We're almost out of time, but Luke, I'll go to you.
Yeah, I'll be brief for sake of time. Many of the big issues, whether it's dealing with China or even issues like Iran and withdrawal of the JCPOA, these issues are not so simple that a new administration could just come in and reverse everything. For one thing, the geopolitical reality does not support that, or would not lead any rational person to believe that, okay, we have a Democrat president, now everything's going to be great with China. So even if there's a change in administration in November, I still think some of the big issues are going to present the same challenges. Perhaps there'll be different nuanced ways that a new administration would approach some of them. We would certainly have less of the, flamboyant Twitter statements and everything else. But I think like when you go down like one level from that, you'll see a lot of continuity because the world's still going to be a dangerous place.
Thank you, Maribeth.
Couldn't agree more. And the threats haven't changed. The major players haven't changed. I probably live in an era much older than both of you when it was believed that foreign policy was a bipartisan issue at its core. I still believe that our interests are bipartisan, and I don't expect much change. And you can't change on a dime, as they say in the DoD. If we're the biggest aircraft carrier, someone would try to turn around as is possible. So any change would be low and slow. Can I apologize to both of you and to the viewers? I got caught in my house that's all windows, and I understand the light behind me and the ceiling fan are a distraction. I deeply apologize. It won't happen again. Next time I'll do this in front of a closet door if I have to.
This has been great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you both spending this hour with us, with our viewers. And I want to thank our attendees for those great questions. And I hope to continue this discussion going forward. And thank you so much. And we are giving you virtual applauses.
Thank you.
Thank you. Be safe, everyone.
Appreciate it.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.